I'd argue that Trump's upset victory in 2016 itself a response to several events. You think about the forever wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, so on and so forth. Trump's election victory in many ways was a repudiation of the Obama agenda. When Trump left office 4 years later, January 6, 2021, how could we forget that moment? His approval rating was only 34%, according to Gallup. And yet Trump defied the odds, rebounded from serious setbacks, including an assassination attempt, to win last year's presidential election. Every time we give him the kiss of death, it's mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He revives and bounces back with tremendous force. May 3, 2025 was arguably the worst election result for the Federal Liberal Party. It was also a great victory for the ALP. Now, usually when first-term governments are up for re-election, they go backwards. So Whitlam in 74 went backwards. Hawke in 84 went backwards. Howard in 98, the GST election, he went backwards. Gillard in 2010, she didn't just go backwards, she lost Labor's majority. And 2016, Malcolm Turnbull lost most of Tony Abbott's parliamentary majority. But in this occasion, in May, Albo and his team won an impressive victory, scoring seats all across the Commonwealth. It was a most impressive victory. Indeed, things have been so dire for the Liberal Party that since May 3, many journalists and academics have written off the party of Menzies and Howard. This is Mark Kenny. Quote, "The Liberals are risking terminal contraction unless they rediscover their progressive urban liberalism and own it very strongly." Nikki Sava, "The Liberal Party is now dying." And that's what the voters are telling them, that they are completely at odds with mainstream Australians. Now, the Liberals, and I'm not here to defend the Liberal Party, I represent classical Liberal views, but the Liberals are in a deep funk. There's no question about it. They're dazed, they're demoralised, they're uncertain about their future direction. And they need to get a sense of what a sound public policy agenda is all about. But does the coalition's election loss on May 3 represent an outright rejection of conservatism? After all, on the battlefields of border protection, national sovereignty and constitutional change, conservative and classical liberal ideas always compete and often prevail. Remember, not so long ago, October 2023, voters easily rejected the Indigenous voice to Parliament, which was part of the identity politics that has become a preoccupation of the global left. Two former CIS colleagues, Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine. My first hire in 2017 was Jacinta Price. Thanks to their outstanding work and others, the referendum lost in all 6 states by a national margin of 60-40, even though the Yes campaign, with the whole establishment on its side, spent more than twice as much as the No campaign. Now, shortly afterwards, I overheard a conversation at the ABC where I was then presenting a weekly radio national program. I've been there for 10 years and I enjoyed my time at the ABC. But I overheard a conversation and a veteran ABC producer was saying in disbelief, "How could so many Australians vote against The Voice? After all, everyone I know voted for The Voice." Now, the purpose of this lecture is to put the Liberal Party's crisis in a broader historical and international context, and to suggest that the media narrative about its troubles is as old as it is overstated. Around 60 years ago, 2 British Prime Ministers summed up the unpredictability of politics. Harold Macmillan, who was in number 10 from 1957 to 1963, he spoke of events, dear boy, events, when referring to the power of circumstances to derail a government or even an opposition from the course it thought it was on. Harold Wilson, Prime Minister from 1964 to 1970, and then again from 74 to 76. He said, "A week is a long time in politics." The notion had been apparent certainly since 1945, when Winston Churchill, as a great war leader who defeated Nazism, was supposed to win a general election. But he lost that year's election to a socialist in one of the biggest landslides in British history. That was partly because the Conservative Party was blamed for appeasing Hitler before the war, but also because of war weariness, not to mention a random and foolish remark that Churchill made during the campaign about the Labor Party resembling the Gestapo. Now, events taking their toll is not, of course, unique to the British political arena. In the period since the Second World War, many events explain the highs and lows of politics. Think of President Lyndon Johnson, who was catapulted into office after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. Think of Richard Nixon, who was catapulted out of office by the Watergate scandal in 1974. You know, in 1972, Nixon won 49 out of 50 states. He won 61% of the national vote. No president had ever carried so many states. No Republican had ever won the presidency by so large a margin. Democrats were dazed and demoralised. And yet, in less than 2 years, Nixon resigned in disgrace, and 2 years later, out of nowhere, a peanut farmer from Georgia came from nowhere to win the White House. Take George H.W. Bush. After America's Gulf War victory in 1991, his approval rating was 89%. 89%. The bookmaker Ladbrokes made Bush the red-hot $1.25 favourite for re-election. This is the US News and World Report. Quote, "No serious Democrat has yet volunteered for the likely suicide mission of running against George Bush." Remember, this is just after the Gulf War. Many Democratic rank-and-filers privately concede 1992 might already be hopeless. For them, the real campaign is 1996. And yet, the war hero with the most decorated presidential CV in history lost to a little-known, philandering, dope-smoking, draft-dodging governor of a small, poor, backwater state in Arkansas. No one saw Bill Clinton coming. And then there's Barack Obama, 2008. Remember his landslide election victory over John McCain, and the Democrats had sweeping majorities, supermajorities in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the overwhelming consensus from the media experts was that the moment represented a political realignment. We were told that the new demographics, most notably the young people and rising minorities, would bury the party of Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan. Pundits agreed. American conservatism was dead, wrote the leading journalist Sam Tannenhouse. E.J. Dionne, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist. The GOP is becoming a regional party of the South whose appeal was confined to the marginalised, angry white men. However, it soon became clear that American conservatism was no more dead than American liberalism in 1981, when Reagan became president, and the Republican corpse was no colder than Bill Clinton's was in 1994, when the Republican Revolution brought Newt Gingrich's Revolutionaries of the Right into the red-hot centre. Bill Clinton's was an impressive victory, but it's part of my story here. By 2010, the midterm elections, the Republicans regained Congress and stymied Obama's legislative agenda. And notwithstanding his re-election in 2012, his presidency was hardly the consequential one many political analysts and historians had predicted. After all, his main legacy was one Donald Trump. Indeed, I'd argue that Trump's upset victory in 2016 itself a response to several events. You think about the forever wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, so on and so forth. The Great Recession, or what we call the global financial crisis. And then Hillary Clinton's candidacy. She was a queen of the liberal establishment. Trump's election victory in many ways was a repudiation of the Obama agenda. When Trump left office 4 years later, January 6, 2021, how could we forget that moment? His approval rating was only 34%, according to Gallup. And like all defeated presidents since Grover Cleveland in 1888, Trump was ripe for only the history books. And yet Trump defied the odds, rebounded from serious setbacks, including an assassination attempt, to win last year's presidential election. Now, I've long argued that we critics, and I am a critic of Donald Trump, he's not a classical liberal, every time we give him the kiss of death, it's mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. He revives and bounces back with tremendous force. Sometimes the fate politicians endure is just. Sometimes it is not. But in a democracy where the maintenance of public support and confidence is paramount, life is like that. But the idea is a two-way street. Winston Churchill, he came back from the dead in 1951 after the failures of the Clement Attlee administration. Lyndon Johnson, he secured his presidency through events and within a year won the election in 1964 to confirm himself in office, but he came unstuck, not least because of the Vietnam War, which turned public opinion against him as victory became more unlikely and bloodshed rose. Having appeared unstoppable, Johnson did not even bother to fight the 1968 election. And then there's Nixon. He lost the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy. He lost the California state governor election race. And he famously told journalists, you don't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is the last press conference. Well, it wasn't. Nixon recovered. He reunited a shattered and fractured GOP. And in 1968, he won the White House at a time of widespread social unrest at home and war abroad. Intriguingly, in 1965, get a load of this. I found this document at the Nixon Library many years ago. When virtually no seasoned observer gave Nixon a chance to make a comeback, this is 65, Nixon encouraged his old Australian friend, Robert Menzies, to write a book on, quote, the exciting mystery of how so many of the world's great leaders have had their most productive years after suffering shattering defeats. Menzies would know. He led a minority government from 39 to 41 before he lost his party's leadership. Widely denounced as aloof, Ming went to the backbench and helped create the Liberal Party, which he led in opposition. By decade's end, Menzies won power and the next 6 elections to become Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. In 1966, he was unique among federal leaders in that he retired at the peak of his power and at a time of his choosing. Which reminds me of another famous British politician, Enoch Powell. He put it best, quote, all political lives, unless they're cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, end in failure, because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. Indeed, politics and human affairs cannot be other than contingent upon events. Whether it's man-made or an act of God, political parties and their leaders are judged by how adroitly or incompetently they cope with the unexpected. The lesson, no victory lasts forever and no downfall is permanent. Now, perhaps nothing better demonstrates Macmillan's dictum than Australian politics. It's often remarked that until the past 2 decades, post-war politics were marked by periods of long, stable governance, from Menzies to Howard. And it is true that in the 23 elections from 1949 to 2004, Australians changed governing parties only 4 times. But even during this period, there were at least 2 elections that upset expectations. One of them was 1975. After the coalition lost power in 1972, Gough Whitlam set out to transform the public policy landscape. It was widely believed that Labor would be in power for a very long time because the Liberals were in dire straits. This is Robert Menzies in a private note in 1974. Get a load of this. The idiots who now run the Liberal Party will drive me around the bend. The so-called little L Liberals, small L Liberals, who run the Victorian Liberal Party believe in nothing but still believe in anything if they think it worth a few votes. The whole thing is quite tragic. Well, the more things that change, the more things stay the same. Yet, within a year, what happened? Malcolm Fraser. Then he was a Conservative. And he came from virtually nowhere to defeat the opposition leader Billy Snedden in a party room ballot before knocking off Gough Whitlam. And we have to remember that this was the largest ever majority in the House of Representatives. And he repeated that landslide in 1977. The great Whitlam dream lasted 3 years. These were dark days for the ALP. Back in late 1975, Labor was out of power everywhere, except for maybe South Australia. I think Don Dunstan was the Premier. The Victorians were led by the Liberals for 20 years. Joe Bjelke-Petersen was still less than halfway through his 2 decades as Premier in Queensland. The Liberals were in power in Sydney and they'd regained power in Western Australia through Charles Court. And then, out of nowhere, within a few months, Neville Wran scored an upset victory in New South Wales, commencing a 12-year reign for Labor. And then you fast forward to 1993. The Coalition went into the March election as the odds-on favourite to win that election. There was a widespread expectation that John Hewson would defeat the 10-year-old Labor government. The arrogant Paul Keating had knifed the popular Bob Hawke in a Labor Party coup. And we had Keating's recession we had to have. I think something like 11% unemployment. And yet, Paul Keating won the election. Or rather, Hewson lost what the press dubbed the unlosable election. However, with Labor's shock victory in 1993, attitudes changed so rapidly that it was suddenly fashionable to write off the Coalition. Judith Brett, the Liberal Party in the 1990s seems doomed. Liberal Senator Chris Puplik. The Liberals are still seen as exclusionist, hostile to new ideas and new people, and too concerned with trying to bring back the good old days. Yet within 2 years, the Liberals on their own, they didn't need a coalition with the Nationals, the Liberals on their own annihilated Keating's government. No one saw that coming. John Howard was widely written off as yesterday's man. Remember his opposition leader? His party dumped him in 1989. He said Lazarus with a triple bypassed. In 1994, he acknowledged he would never ever become leader of the Liberal Party. And the ABC broadcast a program in 1994 called The Political Obituary of John Howard. And yet, 2 years later, John Howard wins a landslide election. Even when he was counted out, Howard somehow bounced back to flatten his opponents, as he did to Kim Beazley in 2001 and Mark Latham in 2004. Now, throughout 2004, the media conventional wisdom was to dismiss Howard's chances against the rising star of Australian politics. Laurie Oakes. It must now be clear to even the most one-eyed Howard backer and to Howard himself that a change of leader before the next poll is imperative. Brian Toohey, barring an electoral miracle, the Liberal ship will go down with Howard still clinging to the helm. Alan Ramsey. People are sick and tired of Howard. Many of us detest him for his duplicity, his divisiveness, and his gross mendacity. Thank you and good night, John Howard. And yet Howard easily defeated Mark Latham. And on the Monday after that election, Alan Ramsey wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, quote, "Latham's time will come. Believe it." The Sydney Morning Herald. which is a reminder, don't believe everything you read in the Sydney Morning Herald. By 2006, Howard and his outstanding treasurer, Peter Costello, had presided over 10 years of unprecedented prosperity, and the Liberals were on top of the highest mountain. Labor Party was in the deepest valley. And yet Howard lost to a nerd from Nambour who dined on his own earwax. and Howard lost... Context is important. This is what people are saying. Howard lost his own seat after 35 years holding that seat, which meant that even John Howard could not defy Enoch Powell's doctrine that all political careers end in failure. The media consensus then, and this was 08-09, was that Kevin Rudd would be in power for a very long time. And to be fair, for a while there, things were very grim for the coalition. I remember I was working for the opposition leader at the time. It was the shortest and worst job of my life. And every week the opinion polls would show that the opposition leader, Brendan Nelson, was Mr. 9% or Mr. 10%. And these were demoralising times. I remember friends would come up to me saying, "Mate, how are you coping? You were working as a senior editor for Rupert Murdoch at The Australian. Now you're working for this loser. You must be dazed and demoralised. How do you cope?" To which I'd reply, "You know, this is nothing. I've been a South Sydney Rugby League supporter all my life." And you know what? 6 years later, the mighty South Sydney Rabbitohs came back to win their first premiership in 43 years. Hey, Tim. Which proves my thesis, what goes down comes back up. From Nelson to Turnbull to Abbott, the Liberals went from hugely unpopular to winning a landslide election in 2013. And they did so by having the gumption to oppose, first, the emissions trading scheme, and then the carbon tax. And I'll just fast forward a lot of this because I was just going to pick on a few journalists and I don't want to be in that mood at the moment. A lot of journalists made a lot of predictions saying basically that if the Liberal Party opposed the emissions trading scheme, they'd be destroyed. Laurie Oakes, Michelle Grattan, Peter Harcher, even Paul Kelly. But when Tony Abbott came into power and did precisely that, oppose the ETS, without missing a beat, the same media pundits said that this was a stroke of genius and that Tony Abbott won the election because he opposed Labor's climate policies. He eventually became victorious, as you all know, in 2013. But in office, he made several self-inflicted mistakes and was eventually dispatched by Malcolm Turnbull. There was, again, context is important, people forget this, but 10 years ago, 2015, there was a real sense of excitement about Australian politics. This is Elizabeth Farrelly in the Sydney Morning Herald. Malcolm, who like Beyonce is known universally by his first name, will be the longest serving Prime Minister since Menzies, possibly ever. And to be fair, the conventional wisdom predicted a big Malcolm Turnbull election victory. But his double disillusion was a spectacular miscalculation. He lost Abbott's massive parliamentary majority and came within a seat of losing power. Against expectations, Turnbull, who at first seemed so capable and confident, came to resemble Rudd in the first half of 2010, adrift, vacillating, and at the mercy of events. Mind you, to say the knives came out for Turnbull would be wrong. Some never put them away in the first place. As a result, the general public's impression steadily grew that Turnbull lost his way, his enemies circled, and he too was dumped in favour of his treasurer, Scott Morrison. For months leading up to the next election in May 2019, the polls and the betting markets, again, people forget this, but they pointed to a resounding Labor victory. The press gallery said that Morrison couldn't possibly win. The evangelical coal cuddler was the wrong man for the times. The former New South Wales tourism boss was steering the tour bus into the electoral abyss. That was a consensus expert view. And on the eve of the election, one bloke even put $1 million on Bill Shorten. Yet, Morrison's quiet Australians disagreed, and the 2019 election went down as the most dramatic failure of discernment in the history of Australian punditry. But then the COVID crisis, which would have challenged any government, unsettled this government, and Morrison eventually lost power in May 2022 to Anthony Albanese. The lesson here is twofold. Political predictions are as reliable as a 12-month weather forecast, And as John Howard often argues, never underestimate the recuperative powers of either of Australia's major political parties. Now, all governments need to be curbed, and the task of restraining the Albanese government will fall on Parliament and the media. Most of all, it will fall on what Macmillan referred to as events, and how the Prime Minister and his opponents respond to those events. Yet for Albanese, the events leading up to the May 3 election conspired to reinforce his position. At the beginning of the year, again, it's hard to remember this, but at the beginning of the year, the betting markets pointed to Peter Dutton winning the federal election. Polls showed that Labor could lose its majority, perhaps even power outright. And the Sydney Morning Herald's journalists looked at the polls and wrote on the front page that they show the government is on course for defeat. I'm not picking on David, he was just reflecting the polls. But the election was overtaken by events. The biggest was the Trump administration's tariffs and all the disruption the new president represented. Taken together with Dutton's poor campaign, the first interest rate cut in over 4 years, the cost of living crisis, which jolted voters into supporting the party of big spending, this disruption pushed voters towards better the devil they know, the Labor Party. Add to this, the tide of history was against the opposition. Only one federal government since 1901, since Federation, has lost power at the first election, and that was during the Great Depression in the early 1930s. So it's no wonder that Australians are temperamentally a conservative people and positively hostile to radical and disruptive change. Now, my history here this evening is not to deny the very real challenges that today's Liberal Party faces. They've got a problem with younger generations, professional women, raising money, stopping the bleeding of Liberal votes to Teal voters or Teal parliamentarians in those metropolitan seats, whether it's Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, or even Perth. They're real challenges, and I'm not sugarcoating these problems. My point, though, this evening is this. The worst government, or the worst threat to governments and political leaders are events, as Harold Macmillan famously identified. And a week is a long time in politics, as Harold Wilson also identified. Anything can happen in 2 to 3 years. Of course, it's very difficult to imagine the coalition bouncing back in the next 2 to 3 years. But you know something? It was inconceivable that the Liberals, on their own, in 1993, could win power in 1996. It was inconceivable that Labor, in 2004, could win power in 2007. It seemed inconceivable in 2019 for the British Labor Party to come back and win a landslide in 2024, and then a year later, if there were an election held today, be lucky to come in third. And it seemed inconceivable in 1991 for the Republicans to lose the White House within a year. When a government is under irresistible pressure from events, the fact that it has a big parliamentary majority is largely irrelevant. And an opposition, however few in numbers, has an opportunity to exploit. It just needs a coherent and sound public policy agenda that distinguishes itself from not just the government of the day, but serves the interests of our great nation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tom. As promised, that was a tour de force. I think you'll all agree. Now, Tom, and thank you, Bob, for coming up here again on a cold night away from our lovely neighbourhood of Coogee. Now, Tom, I think maybe someone could summarise your thesis there of no matter that governments, no matter how big a majority they have, no matter how powerful they look to be, you can count on governments to completely stuff things up and then be thrown out by the people. Never underestimate that. But can I put to you that is this time and now, is this time different? Has politics now completely changed? For 100 years, politics was based on Labor versus capital. The workers went with Labor, Labor Party. It was the party of workers, Bob's great party. Business went with the Liberal, and the farmers went with the Country Party or the Nationals. It was Labor v capital, and now it's transformed like a Rubik's cube into identity and culture. With Labor v capital, you could get an overlap of interests in they both had an interest in growing the size of the pie, and they could have an argument about the distribution. But when it becomes identity and culture, it becomes much more tribal, becomes much more divided and fragmented, and one tribe almost needs the other tribe to fight against to self-validate their own beliefs. You could say that the parties are they dying? Labor won 2/3 of seats at the May election with only 1/3 of the primary vote. Now, Bob Hawke got just a touch under 50% in 1983. So it's culture and identity combined with this whole dynamic of technology and the internet and social media. And we were talking about in the green room earlier on that when Bob decided to resign, rarely at the top of his powers in 2005, I was the editor of The Australian, and Bob gave me the courtesy of ringing me to say that he was just about to announce his retirement. It was big news. I thought, oh, gee, maybe we should get it up on this thing called the internet. It was a new sort of thing like that. It doesn't dominate like it really does today. The coalition, of course, has gone down to 32% of the vote. You know, it's at a real historic low point. And either the parties maybe is there a risk of the Liberal Party perhaps dying like the Liberal Party in the UK in 2018, or does it have to become something else? Like, as you said, Hillary Clinton couldn't bury the party of Abraham Lincoln and Ronald Reagan, but perhaps Donald Trump did and has taken over and made it something completely different. So and I'll ask Tom and then throw to Bob, could this time be different?
Well, the question here is, that's right, the Western politics, far from being defined by the age-old left-right capital Labor divide, is increasingly framed around issues like values and identity. And the centre-right parties, certainly in the United States under Trump, and the Tories under Boris Johnson, did a very good job of winning over a lot of working-class constituencies. I'll never forget 20 years ago, in 2005, there was a book published by Geoffrey Wheatcroft called The Strange Death of Tory England. And this was just before Tony Blair's third election victory. He won in 97, 2001, and even after the debacle in Iraq, he still won a comfortable majority in 2005. And Wheatcroft's argument was that the Tories were losing, they had no real connection with Middle England, particularly working class and lower income constituencies. And yet 5 years later, David Cameron won. Admittedly, it was a minority government with the Liberal Democrats. He got a majority in 2015. Theresa May went backwards in 2017, but then Boris Johnson in 2019, running on a Trump-esque platform of appealing to working class constituencies on values and culture. He smashed Labor's red wall of working class constituencies in Northern England and the Midlands. So I think what's happening here is that in the United States and in Britain, the centre-right parties have tried to tap into that new terrain. Now, the Tories have gone backwards, but they've just simply been replaced by Nigel Farage's Reform Party. He's the right-wing counter now to Labor, picking up a lot of those working-class constituencies. In Australia, it's not so evident, and I would argue that's because we've had real income growth and a booming economy from the 80s from the early 90s recession right throughout the 2000s until the early 2010s. Since the early 2010s, and Michael, you've written a lot about this, our political leaders have just been trading off the benefits of the China-fueled resources development boom. We haven't put in place sound productivity-enhancing reforms. But there will come a day when our working class constituencies' incomes and their standards of living don't rise like they did in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And when that happens, I think we'll see a same type of realignment that is clearly evident in Britain and the United States.
Now, Bob, is this time different? Is the landscape fundamentally changing, or can we expect to see the historical narrative that Tom set out, that a party in power such as we see now is very vulnerable even after one term?
We seem to be rescued in this country from the prospect of minority nation. Remember Megalogenus's essay? He predicted minority nation based on this tendency in voting patterns. It didn't happen, and what rescued us from having a vast non-aligned bloc in the House of Representatives was the Australian invention of preferential voting, what the Americans called a transfer vote, a single transferable vote. That saved us. It saved us from that nightmare of a vast bloc that a Liberal Prime Minister or a Labor Prime Minister would have to negotiate with. And that was relief. How long we get that relief from that quirk in our voting system, combined with compulsory voting, which helps, I'm not sure. But as for now, we're saved from... Here's an idea. Should we formalise the growth of the decline of the big political parties by begin talking about proportional representation in the lower house? That would at least formalise it. We'd have a lower house elected on the same principles as the German Bundestag, and we would know where we stand. Yeah, well, that's one fate you'd have. You'd also have it if the megalogenous proposition ever came true, and that was the decline of the major parties becomes so severe, you're dealing with any prime minister from their ranks having to negotiate endlessly with a huge crossbench. I don't know what you do. I mean, if I'm running the Liberal Party today or advising its leader with a contract of $1 million a year, I don't know what advice I would give. I think it could well be an insoluble problem. How you accommodate the challenge, how you meet the challenge of the teal tendency, where safe seats, all the North Shore, is in the hands of people who elevated the importance of environmental considerations. That's a major block. And yet at the same time, the Dutton dream of winning outer suburban seats to compensate hasn't come off, and Labor, against my expectations, revived itself somewhat in Queensland. I thought we were doing so badly in Queensland that it was money in the bank for any coalition leader as far as the eye could see. I don't know. When a party's got no obvious strategy, you need a leader so gifted at improvisation. There are distractions in the air that stop people thinking about the fundamentals. And the tactical matters are elevated and dramatised and debated by an inspired and clever leader.
Both Bob, I'll try and press you on advice to parties. Paul Kelly wrote in the Australian at the weekend that, writing on the Liberal Party, said that it needed to go back to its core values. It needed to go back very quickly to its core values and to argue them strongly for 3 years, not for just a matter of weeks or months towards an election campaign. Otherwise, its decline would accentuate. And Paul quoted Peter Costello saying that the core values should be higher productivity, smaller government, lower tax, personal liberty. John Howard said the core values should be individual liberty versus collectivism. And Tony Abbott said, well, you should welcome a fight. What variation on that? I know you said it's very hard and you need someone to transcend that and just cobble together something else, but
make it up as they go along.
But are those core values?
Well, in the CIS, let's give due weighting to what should be a core value of Conservative parties: the size and function of government, smaller government. Can there be agreement across the Conservative side of politics on this proposition? I would hope there would be. I would hope that there'd be an opposition party challenging Labor to prove that taxpayers are getting value for the big increase in public sector outlays. But there doesn't seem, if I were a Liberal, I'd be worried about the fact that there doesn't seem to be a constituency within the Liberal voter base or within the Liberal Party membership, within its parliamentary membership, for aggressively saying, well, in Kevin Rudd's words in 2007, this spending has to stop.
I write in the paper towards the end that, the left side of politics generally likes to increase the size and the scope of the government. And so it's incumbent on centre-right parties to seek to shrink it to the point that wealth and power can be returned to the people and they can be left to plan their own lives. And two issues at CIS that reflect this mindset are housing affordability and schools education. One of the main reasons why we have such a high prices for housing in inner city Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and Perth and whatnot is because of the supply restrictions. It's government restrictions of supply and other taxes and regulations. So this seems to me a good way for the Liberal Party to win over younger generations to say, vote for us and we will help reduce the costs of housing. And on education, it's been more than 10 years, probably 15 years now, since the Gillard government put in place what was called the Gonski Schools Revolution, where the government was spending millions and millions of tax dollars on boosting school outcomes in numeracy and literacy. And guess what? During the course of the last 10 to 15 years, literacy and numeracy standards have declined, which means that it's not the government that can help improve outcomes. So I think just on those two issues, schools and housing, seems to me from a CIS classical Liberal perspective, that's a great opportunity for any centre-right party to take issue with the federal government.
Yes, I think that's a very good point, Tom, that notwithstanding which party's in power, the climate can still change. And as you say now, the whole debate on housing, thanks to the work at CIS and Peter Tulip, quite frankly, has shifted towards the idea that it's all the demand side and what the problem is negative gearing tax concessions and the capital gains tax concessions, that's all the problem, to the idea that zoning and planning regulations have produced, as they say, a vertical supply curve for housing, and increased demand has just spilled into higher prices, and that's been the problem. It's been a supply side restriction. Of course, once you point to one of the biggest issues in Australia of the supply side, in Canada, the Conservative opposition leader in Canada, who got knocked off by Mark Carney only because of the Trump effect when Trump wanted to take over Canada, he campaigned relentlessly for years, a couple of years beforehand, on liberalising supply of housing. And at the election that he lost, he still got the majority of the youth vote. And so that really shows that you can change the sort of the policies. And now in Labor, they are talking about thickets of red tape, not so much regulation. And even the housing minister, they're all talking about the supply side. And we like the supply side. We think that's where the policy area should be, on restrictions on the supply side. Then, as Tom says, in the education area with Jennifer Buckingham and then Glenn Fay, the CIS has helped change the whole narrative on schools and the idea that you don't have to teach students. They can all find it out by themselves. You don't have to be in classrooms. You don't have to learn your times tables. You don't have to get the basics. And in a way, the progressive side of politics hasn't been called to account for that. But it has been a change now, which has now become the conventional wisdom. So, and at the CIS now, I think with the board, and I should acknowledge some of the Nicholas Moore as the chairman here, and Philippa Stone and Chris Roberts, and no doubt some others from the board, are putting are behind an agenda on productivity and prosperity, and so we're getting into some of these supply side issues. So, in going to Bob as to how, and then Tom as to how you sell this, it seems that, as you're suggesting, a lot of the population seems to quite like the idea of bigger government and a bigger care economy, and the government will look after them, and for every problem there should be more government spending and more regulation. Now, they might not like it when the bill comes to pass. And Robert Carling made a big splash here the other day when pointing out that 50% or so of the population now relies on government for the majority or close to the majority of their income. And that really resonated around the place, and people start to say, whoa, wait a minute. And when things don't, start to not work, as presumably they're not going to work as they should, is there a scope? How would you've had a lot of experience with the Labor Party, Bob, obviously, the influence of the public sector unions, the idea that the voters like governments to fix things and regulate things. How would you approach that?
Well, the first principle is to say no, to get into the habit in government of saying to the New South Wales Council of Social Security, for example, your idea of us borrowing $3 billion is back in 1996 money, to spend on recurrent spending on all the things that are important is something we're not going to do. You don't borrow for recurrent spending. You borrow only for capital purposes. We're not going to be able to do it. There are probably other examples, but the habit of saying, no, we can't afford it has got to be cultivated. And I think there would be a slab of middle opinion comforted by a political leader who says, it is a great idea, but I've got to tell the families of Australia, if we did it, there'd be a huge burden of debt on their children. I think that's a sort of rhetoric that people want to hear, especially, I guess, from the conservative side of politics. What strikes me, looking at my own side and focusing on Victoria, is how the old principle that no one learns from history has been confirmed. No one learns from history. And I've said to Steve Bracks, I said, how is it that your generation, the Labor Party, had to live down the cane overspending when debt and deficit was set where it was seen as not mattering, and you suffered a savage defeat, and you had Kennett's privatisations. This had to be an educative experience, and it worked with you. But then the next generation, Daniel Andrews, is approaching huge spending and big unhealthy deficits as if they were virtues. Nobody learns. And the Robert Carling, who does great research, and congratulations to you for using his talents out of New South Wales Treasury, said to me once when I was rang him up to get some advice on this, he said, the public finances of Australia, this would have been 18 months ago, are very vulnerable. So this raises the question of whether you need state budget collapses like those in Victoria that brought down John Cain and ushered in Jeff Kennett before people will start accepting the argument, it's a nice idea, but we can't afford to do it. Then you've got the whole issue that we can't overlook, and that is of the burden of the massive regulatory growth in Australia.
I thought one of the most significant polls in the lead up to the last federal election was a news poll, front page of the Australian, Michael. 83% of the Australian people believed to deal with the cost of living pressures, governments needed to spend more tax dollars. 83%. So the people around Peter Dutton would say to me and my friends at CIS, you're in a think tank, we want to win an election. The only way we can win an election is by me tooing Labor on this issue. That's what they would argue. And at first glance, it's a compelling argument because it's 83% of the people. But they'd never made the counter-argument that more stimulus, more tax dollars, more spending will just put more pressure on inflation, upward pressure on interest rates, and around we go. I think the problem here is that there's no one in Canberra like Peter Costello who's prepared to challenge what's called the magic money tree. You know, the idea that growth is a given, that budgets don't need to be balanced, that you can finance unlimited amount of borrowing. The MMT, what's that called?
Modern monetary theory.
It just doesn't work. And in the end, it's not the rich who pays, it's everyone.
Yes, well, it was the extra spending during the pandemic and the very low interest rates that caused the inflation, which is not sort of widely appreciated, I don't think, amongst it. But again, we'll take questions in a moment.
And Michael, I'd also say those policies helped bring down Joe Biden.
When you get problems, problems occur in public life, and there's always a pressure on governments to spend more or to regulate more. And we were talking about childcare, for example, and we've had the instance recently of some terrible things happening in childcare centres, including private childcare centres. And there's a suggestion that we should regulate more. What would you? That seems to be, you can imagine that response. What would you say to that? Given you've dealt with provision of services, public sector unions, and the like.
You'd like to see an argument: is regulation what went wrong here, or might it be something else? Might it be lack of training, for example? Could you address the scandals that have been exposed in childcare centres by making a commitment to more effective training? Not lavishing more money on it, but having someone look at the curricula and the requirements, the content, course content, as in education, as in schooling. We're looking at resources. We don't always rarely look at the content of the curricula. So that's what I do. We had a Royal Commission into abuses in aged care accommodation. I spoke to Mike Baird, who ended up running a big institution. He said, as a result of the new regulations that flowed from that, if a residential centre has to spend more on a defective air conditioning or water facility, they've got to note that. And that becomes an official document. Any bank lending money to them has got to look at that record, and it becomes an issue. We settled on a new regulation for access to trained nursing care 24/7. And who could argue, in theory, with that provision? But what if you've got a mum and pop aged care facility in a country town, say a small country town, that's on the margin, but it's meeting the needs and helping aged people get residential care in a community close to people they know, friends and family. It's serving an overriding public good, even if they've got some other facility for getting in a trained nurse when a health emergency requires it. But no, we've posited that there must be on board 24/7 access to nursing care. Is the constant upping of standards achieving a goal, or might it be counterproductive in the sense that there'll be fewer aged care beds in rural and regional areas as a result of us simply saying, in response to a scandal, more regulation? With building, and your point about supply side, you've just got to look at industrial relations, even higher on the list.
We're not allowed to talk about that these days.
Even higher on the list.
Labor Party's not allowed to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I'd let you talk about it. Is that more important than the regulations? With the revelation recently that the CFMEU has got a 2-workday week as an award standard. We thought Pat Clancy and Jack Mundy...
They must be very productive during those 2 days.
Challenges.
Max, over to questions. Thank you.
Michael, thank you. Peter Curti from the Centre for Independent Studies. Michael, thank you. Tom, thank you very much for your remarks, and Mr. Carr for your observations. You've been talking about economic values, and I wonder if I could just move us on to what we might call cultural values, because many argue on the left, in the media and the Labour Party, that the Liberals' path back to power depends on abandoning these culture wars and embracing a more progressive social agenda to win back younger voters. And yet we know from history that political revivals have rarely come from chasing the other side's cultural values, and that core convictions can in fact be an electoral asset. So my question to the three of you is the Liberal Party's real challenge to modernise by diluting its philosophical commitments, or to re-articulate them in a way that speaks to a broader Australia without surrendering its principles?
Thank you, Peter. As for the charge that Liberals are waging culture wars, what progressives mean here is that it's perfectly fine for them to advance their cultural agenda with new rules, new ideas, new ways of doing things, often via the least democratic and accountable measures such as DEI bureaucracies, that's fine. But anyone who resists that is somehow, that's an act of aggression. When the left shouts culture war, that's their way of saying we don't want to be part of this battle of ideas. And I think that the lesson of the Voice referendum in October 2023, the annual fracas over Australia Day, I think that shows that the Australian people are tired of it. And I think that as John Howard's point, the ordinariness of Australian conservatism, the underbelly there, is still very relevant on a lot of these cultural issues. So, for example, we all too often hear that the centre of the political and cultural landscape has shifted left over the last few years. We've moved on from the Howard era. But on border protection, on constitutional change, the Australian people are still with the Howard agenda on refugees, the Republic, and reconciliation. So I think there's a danger here in going too far towards bowing to the zeitgeist.
Well, but Australian people culturally conservative or culturally progressive?
Yeah, I think we've got to be very careful about generalisations here. The National Party in New South Wales voted 100% in favour of assisted dying. National Party, state parliament. I think I'm right in that. And I think they're overwhelmingly in support of, overwhelmingly voted to take abortion out of the Crimes Act. So there's a fair bit of crossover, and I'd be. I mean, the test for measures in the social dimension is: will they work? Do they make us a more decent society? Apply that test. And I was persuaded when I was Premier, while I'd always been explicitly opposed to what was promoted at the time as heroin trials, I was persuaded that a medically supervised injecting room would have a positive effect. It would reduce the deaths that occurred when people were injecting in alleyways in King's Cross or in car parks in King's Cross. So it passed a simple, pragmatic test. It wasn't a bit of flag-waving policy adventurism to rally progressive support. It passed a pragmatic test. There were fewer deaths as a result of overdose, and it had no unintended consequences. But I did that as Premier with a bit of credibility because I'd opposed things like a heroin trial. Here's another example: as these things are complex, and you can be on as Beethoven said, the opposite is also true. As Premier in my first term, I thought it was a common sense argument that transsexual people should be brought under the Anti-Discrimination Act, and it got through the State House with the support of the then opposition. But when my Attorney General brought in measures that would have seen churches, including church schools, brought in under the Anti-Discrimination Act, I was able to say, we're not doing it. Why shouldn't they be able to apply their measures? They're outside the public sector, the civil sector. So, and I was able to tell Cardinal Pell and the Anglican Archbishop that was the approach we were taking when the Green Party introduced legislation to haul churches under the Anti-Discrimination Act. So I'd just be totally pragmatic about these measures, and I think that's the best advice the Liberal Party can weigh. Why not go back to your basics and rally your base when it comes to the key challenge, the size and function of government? We as Conservatives, the party could say, can get taxpayers' value for money and see that your youngsters aren't going to be carrying a debt burden that constricts their living standards because we couldn't stop our profligate spending.
Yeah, much of the, if I could just say, much of the discussion has predicated itself on the idea that there will be two major parties, or the coalition being for one, effectively one major party. But curiously, if you look at much of the rest of the world, and particularly continental Europe, you've got large successful democracies where that concept has gone some time ago. used to be that the Christian Democrats and Socialists, or their variations in various Western European countries, were the dominant feature, and there were other minor parties. But that's gone. And equally perhaps has gone the concept that was in Gilbert and Sullivan, that every Englishman that was ever born was born a little conservative or a little liberal. That was also true in large measure in Australia. People tended to follow families virtually as to whether they voted Labor or Liberal. That's gone also, or is severely eroded. So are we not better in many ways to say, well, it's going to be very probable that we will, in fact, as time goes by, have more and more effective coalitions to make government, because there will not be those divisions that have been inherent in English-speaking societies, putting them into just two camps. And frankly, I think that's the way in which we're likely to go. And curiously enough, in many parts of Europe, of course, that's been extremely successful, particularly in Scandinavia.
Yes, it's a less collectivist, less uniform, more fragmented, more diverse world, Tom, isn't it? And
it is. All that's true, and I think that reflects the whole media and digital landscape. You know, we get our media sources now from such a wide variety. You don't have to read certain newspapers the way they used to, or listen to the ABC or watch the ABC that we all used to when we were growing up, because there's so many different outlets now to tune into. Podcasts, cable television and whatnot. Same thing applies to politics. But I'd still argue, though, that even though the Labor Party won 33% of the primary vote, they still had a huge majority in the House of Representatives. In a two-party preferred system, they're the beneficiaries of that. Even in Britain, in the 2024, July 2024 general election, Keir Starmer's Labor Party only won 34% of the vote. And yet they had 66% of the House of Commons. So I think ultimately you're still going to have governments in power that reflect pretty significant majorities, even when you have that decentralisation of power.
this is the question, isn't it, Bob? You think that's the case? Or has the Labor Party got a winning strategy now of domination by convincing the majority of the population that vote for us and you'll get universal childcare, universal other benefits, and then on the other side they've rallied your friends, the public sector unions, into a very effective ground force to deliver the vote that any other political organisation in Australia just can't match?
Well, there is something of a strategy there. If a government can retain a bit of freshness, how long does the media give a political leader, a prime minister, these days? We might find out after midway through this term.
What do you think of the world in which there is no majority government, but it's an Australian context of proportional representation, which I think you've proposed here tonight? That's a good news story.
I proposed looking at it and debating it.
And that how would that work in an Australian context of the horse trading that you'd need to get on with that? Is in a country like Australia, do we need a strong government, or do we need a government that is weak and always bargaining with other interests?
Well, in the European context, which our interlocutor raised, it's all based on proportional representation. So they've formalised smaller political parties sharing power, and they've made it easy for it to happen after an election. In most of those jurisdictions, it still takes months to put together a government in Belgium. But do we want to go down that path? Or are Australians more comfortable with the exaggerated strength that single member constituencies combined with preferential voting and compulsory voting gives our system? Do we live with the fact that there's a disproportionate majority available and we get more stability in government as a result? Perhaps Australians are drawn to that.
Michael, there's no silver bullet here. In 2012, Campbell Newman and the Queensland LNP won a massive landslide election victory. I think Anastasia Palaszczuk and her Labor Party was confined to something like 7 seats in the parliament. It was a huge landslide. And yet 3 years later, despite, what many economists were saying were sound overdue cuts to the public sector, Campbell Newman lost in a landslide within one term.
Hi, good evening. My name's Rory Robertson. The panel's highlighted the issue that the public seems to be addicted to free taxpayer money. The more than half of the community main income is from the government. You've got record levels of government spending to GDP. You've got record low levels of means testing. The idea that the way to victory is sort of taking a tougher position sort of doesn't really ring true to me in the sense that, Australia's debt to GDP is, public debt to GDP is only about 40%. The US is 100, Japan's 200. So it's actually the budget constraint story seems to have eroded. The budget constraint problem seems to be broken for now. Is it a good idea for the Conservative parties to push a tougher sort of public spending or higher tax ideas if they want to get back into government?
Yeah, Bob, does it seem that just governments can just spend what they want now? Well, that must be different to what it was in your time. Surely, your AAA rating would be a big thing, and you'd really you've got to sell your paper in the marketplace. But now the bond markets don't seem to be that concerned about it. Does it seem?
Yeah, I know, but it cannot go on. I just think we all read Ayn Rand's dystopian novels when we were younger. I feel we're living in one of those novels now. The rise in homelessness, and I'd hate to go back and read them and discover. I mean, she said, "Do you know what political party?" It's a trivia question. You think you're pretty good after your presentation, but what political party, which Republican candidate did Ayn Rand support in the 1976 Reagan challenge to Gerald Ford? You'd expect it to be, yes. No, you'd expect it to be Reagan, but my memory is that she supported Gerald Ford because he had the guts as president to reject a big spending bill, to veto a big spending bill. And she thought, that's authentic. That's what she's been advocating. And Gerald Ford maybe is a kind of model here. We wouldn't have thought of it. He's dismissed as a mediocre president. But remember when he stood firm when New York went bankrupt? And he said he wasn't going to provide federal money to rescue New York from its profligacy. And the New York Daily News had a headline, Ford the city, drop dead.
I mean, the real problem, of course, as Robert Carling has pointed out, are the areas of government programs where their spending is increasing as a percentage of the GDP. So obviously, NDIS, Gonski schools, childcare, aged care, you could probably say defence, and then interest on debt.
Thanks. Tom, the stat you didn't raise is the count of teal volunteers. And it may be worth sharing with the room. The political parties are averaging about 30 volunteers per seat. The Teals are running 1,200 to 1,600 volunteers in 100,000 person electorates. So I just wanted to ask a question about listening. It's a theme that hasn't come up tonight. Neither major party seems to listen. They seem to just be top down. And to the point from the gentleman at the back, the Teals haven't engaged in giveaway politics. So is the difference listening and listening better rather than the maybe simpler theme that it's just giveaway politics?
One of the things I find about the Teals, and you hear the grabs, is that it seems to be often about they say our people want to have their voice heard, and they might not. They'll be a member in a government where in a parliament where there's a majority government, and they'll have no influence at all really if they've just a few seats in a parliament with a majority government. But that still seems to be a selling point, that they just want to have people represent what they think are their values, and just to say them, and to have them sort of say it seems to be the point of that under identity and culture politics. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing, but it seems to be what's driving them.
Yeah, can we nurture, just to return to the theme of smaller government, is it possible to nurture an ethos in which a political leader, I presume more likely a Conservative leader, would say no? Here's a story from Ben Chifley, of all people. It's buried in his biography by Finn Crisp. He was under pressure after Laurence Olivier did a famous tour of Australia, bringing quality theatre to our capital cities. It was famous at the time, but it galvanised interest in whether there should be an Australian national theatre. And it was put to Chifley, and his response was, he said, "I don't know about that, but I think Canberra could do with a good brass band." But Chifley's frugality, Prime Minister 1945 to 1949, was serious because he went into the 49 election against Menzies, who was promising a rise in child endowment. And Chifley, as a Labor Prime Minister, with a huge record of assuming federal responsibility for social security, including child endowment, which had been paid by the states, Chifley said, "No, we can't afford it." And a lot of his Labor colleagues, while enormously respectful of him, thought that his frugality did cost Labor the 49 election, that and his position on petrol rationing. But is it possible to contemplate an ethos where the Conservative side of Australian politics can enunciate and defend wittily, defend cleverly the notion of smaller government and saying no, and talking about we're cutting this so we can do that. So that's an argument that or I was always told by my campaign director to call it, we're not doing that, but that's going to liberate resources to do this. Greiner did it, but closing the government printing office. We're doing this so we can find, or in my case, we're privatising capital works for schools because it's going to save $50 million a year, which we can put into teachers, extra teachers for kids with disabilities. It's that sort of trade-off argument that I think could get us there. But in the meantime, I think we're agreed the case for smaller government is not being picked up by either side of politics.
Two parts. Number one, where do you see the Liberals going forward from the whole of the 2025 election? And number two, with a particular respect to the youth vote.
Well, on the youth vote, I think it's appealing to them on housing affordability, as I mentioned earlier. I think this housing affordability is a real problem for younger generations. The 20s, 30s, 40s, even well-to-do people, they don't own assets. So pushing hard on development and supply, it's going to upset a lot of the old brigade in those Teal seats, Bradfield, for example, but it'll help win over a lot of younger people, I think. I think net zero, no one's raised that as an issue. I think that's a legitimate public policy issue to raise doubts about the pace of net zero. And, the best person to quote on this isn't Tony Abbott or my old friend Nigel Lawson, but Tony Blair. Tony Blair is a former British Prime Minister who's a climate enthusiast. He says politicians should face inconvenient facts which show that any policy based on phasing out fossil fuels by 2050 was doomed to fail. This is Tony Blair. It's wrong that people are being asked to make financial sacrifices and changes in lifestyle when they know that their impact on global emissions is minimal. So the right goal, I think, for the Liberals should be the pace of change, not to its long-term necessity.
But how vulnerable is the government on electricity costs, prices, that despite renewables supposedly being the cheapest form of energy, clearly their transition is far more expensive than advertised. We're seeing the cost structure go up. Australia's lost its clean energy advantage. I don't think we're going to get it back anytime soon under any scenario. That's starting to see a deindustrialisation of various smelters, of which now the government's going to prop up with taxpayer money. How vulnerable could Labor be on high energy costs?
In theory, vulnerable, but don't forget that Labor won power originally in an election where an overwhelming, a very significant majority of voters, in explaining why they went for Labor, nominated one of several environmental concerns. So if I'm on the Conservative side, I'd think carefully about beating a retreat on this. When politicians make a statement, it resonates years into the future. When Scott Morrison, with that lump of coal in his hand, gave the impression the conservative side of Australian politics was opposed to targets on climate transition. He set off a movement that has seen, how many Till seats are there? 7 in the Parliament? Now, that's a big price to pay. When Peter Dutton, as Minister for Defence, made certain statements amounting to, of course, if there were a war over Taiwan, we'd be in it with the Americans. He produced a reaction from previously conservative Chinese background voters that saw them move to the Labor column, and even more decisively in the last election. You saw that in Reid and Bennelong in Sydney, but other seats as well. I'd be very cautious about unravelling that as an issue again. I think the high cost, but what are you going to do about the high cost? Just on the youth vote, in answer to your question, I can only repeat what is the consensus in the Labor Party, that young people streaming into polling booths welcomed Labor's spending commitments on free TAFE, help with university fees, and more government involvement in housing. So that argues against my own predilection that we've got to get a conversation going about smaller government. That would be an example of how the electorate, a section of the electorate, young voters, were actually reaching out for government largesse.
Warren Hogan, I just wanted to address one of the issues brought up, a very depressing issue that was raised about this money tap that seems to be government spending, and to agree with Bob what you're trying to instinctively get at and talk to you about an economist's perspective. There is constraints on government, and the Pandora's box of the last 20 years has been quantitative easing, which removes that need to be able to sell government debt at any point in time. The central bank can buy it, but of course that will eventually be inflation, and inflation is a tax in another form. And then it's just delaying the inevitable adjustment. So there is no free lunch in terms of this stuff, and it gets worse, of course. Here in Australia, Rory's point is right that we have one of the lowest government debts in the world, and in this country we need to measure both state and federal debt when we make these calculations. So we're around 50-60%, say. The Europeans and Americans are starting to get worried at 100 to 110, 20. The Japanese are at 250%. Now, they demographically are leading the world, and I would recommend we do not follow their pathway of using government spending to paper over the problems. They are the canary in the coal mine. But here in Australia, we built an economy in the last 40 years based on disciplined government, which started in your era of the 90s, out of that recession. And over the last 30 years, we might have low government debt, but we have the highest household debt in the world. The Japanese, with their 250% of GDP of government debt, have one of the lowest household debts in the world. Our productivity has collapsed in this country in the last 3 years. The government deflecting to say, the last 10 years has been bad. The last 10 years was weaker productivity than we'd had in that golden era of the 90s and noughties, but it's getting collapsed now, and a big part of that is an inefficient allocation of resources in our economy, and that's because the growth of government spending, and that's because the government used to allocate about 20% of the jobs in the economy in the private sector, 80. It's now up to over half. We're not allocating our resources well. Our productivity is starting to decline. That is our income and our ability to service debt and so forth. So we have a big issue to deal with in this economy. This brilliant economy we built in the last 40 years is under pressure. And I think we're right on the edge of the pressures that big government spending are bringing to bear, and that's showing up as weak productivity. So I don't think there's any apathy that needs to be played into about the ability of any government in Australia to just keep spending, because it will show up in our economy as pressure and distress very quickly, in my view.
Thank you very much for that, Warren. I think that was a very apt punctuation to our discussion tonight. I think it has been a tour de force by Tom, a terrific thing by him. And thanks again for Bob Carr for coming in and filling in for John Howard. I think it was brilliant to hear diverse views, including from the other side of the aisle of the political divide. That's been terrific. It's been really instructive. And so I'd like to, could you please join me in thanking Tom and Bob?
For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.